Dear audience, dear distinguished speakers, I welcome you all to a very exciting talk and panel discussion today. The topic of our coming together is language and cultural diversity, the impact of media on immigrant communities. My name is David Campbell. I'm an associate professor for comparative political science at the University of Vienna. Our two speakers today are in alphabetical orders, and ladies first. It is Dr. Sarah Buzarczuk. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, Poland. Our second speaker is Professor Florian Kulmas. He is a senior professor of Japanese society and sociolinguistics at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. We decided that we're going to use first names when we're going to talk. The whole conversation is planned for about 60 minutes. And in that sense, I would say, let us begin with this very interesting topic and discussion. Now, coming from an academic background, one way to begin an academic exercise is, of course, to refer to something like definition of terms. Yes. So in that sense, I would like to ask both of you how, in that sense, you define media in that sense, in the context of our following conversation. And second, how you define immigrant communities. Yes. And maybe also you could indicate a little bit what you see here as changes taking place, possible trends, and then we're going to move on, so to say, more into medias res. This is a question to both of you. I do not know who would like to pick this question up first.
Sarah?
Okay.
Yes.
So in terms of how I define media, I think the definition of media is quite dynamic in a way that it really follows what the communities use, both in terms of native communities and immigrant communities. And when I was at university, it was, radio, newspaper, and TV, whereas nowadays it's kind of all outdated, and it's more of all kind of, or I would consider media as all sort of online platforms, communication technologies or communicators, softwares, and so on. TV as well and radio, but this is kind of becoming more, less popular as opposed to the online tools. But also in terms of, broadcast podcasts, internet channels, and so on. So I would say it's quite dynamic what we include in the media.
Mm-hmm. The immigrant communities you also would like to refer to shortly, or then in a second round?
Might do as well. So it's actually because I'm working in migrants in Center for Migration Research, we kind of take for granted who the immigrants are. But in Polish context as well as all the other countries, I guess these are the nationalities or the migrants who come and stay in certain countries, either for a short period of time or for much longer. This would not include tourism traveling, but these don't really rely on the sort of media channels. But for sure, we face more sort of emerging communities, especially immigrant communities, especially in Poland. But those that are more settled, we would talk about diaspora that is, much more embedded in the immigrant structures. So those who come to the hosting countries for shorter or longer period of time, I would count them as immigrants.
Well, thank you for this.
Sorry, of course, status also matters, but for this reason, I guess we can account them collectively.
Well, thank you for this very interesting entree. Florian, what is your approach to these two basic questions in a certain sense and ways how to define them?
You said 60 minutes?
Yeah, this is so to say what I was told.
Okay,
Yes, about 60 minutes altogether.
Let's start with a little personal aspect. David Campbell, a typical Austrian name.
Of course.
Kulmas. Well, let me tell you, the past 2 years I lived in The Hague in the Netherlands. I have nowadays a German passport. Was I an immigrant in The Hague? Was I probably not, because the European Union allows free movement among all member states. Does that have an influence on what we consider immigrants? It should have, but it is not at all easy to say how. I have, on the other hand, I lived in Japan for 3 decades, and there I was easily identified for various reasons as an immigrant. I had permanent residence. I was visibly not of Japanese descent. My language had a little accent, fluent though, but accented. And there were other aspects that made me an immigrant. So your question is really very, very difficult to answer, which makes the entire subject of this discussion quite interesting, because we could challenge one another's definition of who or what an immigrant is. Media is by no means easier. Well, we should take a look at that.
Yes.
That's media.
Yes.
And our discussion circulates around the influence of media. There we should take a few seconds to just consider one thing. Writing is the most important invention of human history. There can be no doubt about this. A second, also very important invention is printing with movable type. This was invented in China much earlier than in Europe, but in Europe, since the 15th, early 16th century, this new medium of print had enormous effects on language. Effects that we can still observe today because printed language, printing, is not just fixing language. It's changing language fundamentally. Just think of an expression like the literal meaning. Is there no literal meaning in languages that are not written and not printed? Probably so. It's not for no reason that we are talking about literal meanings. So the introduction of printing, and if you want me to, I can talk about this more later, changed very many things in language and in society. And nowadays, we are observing a similar process where new media, and let's call them new media because the range is very broad, where new media have an enormous impact on language behavior, and society, social configurations. Let me just mention one thing. Internet penetration has reached 100%, has exceeded 100% in many countries, and around the world it is approaching 70%. And that means we are dealing with a global phenomenon. And it means that for the first time in history, we may be dealing with the populations who write more than they speak. This is a revolution unheard of. And it is still very, very difficult to assess the consequences of this innovation, a new social domain that has opened. And we can observe certain implications of writing among our students. But it is very difficult to assess all the consequences, which is partly because it is so difficult to define what media are in our present day and age.
Okay, well, fascinating to listen to both of you. Maybe just as a short note, referring to my own family biography. So this is a topic which, of course, interests me personally very much. With a mother from Austria, a father from the United States, and a wife from France. So this, in that sense, everything here is coming together. Whereas, I mean, I think it's always good at the beginning of a talk like this, of course, to reflect about the basic concepts and what the meanings are in association. Now, to flow on with our conversation, when the internet came, I mean, this was about around the year 2000, at least in continental Europe, maybe in other countries a little bit before. So this means it's about 25 years or 30 years ago. There were, on the one hand, certain fears articulated this, and I think the one fear was the internet could lead to certain standardization effects. In that sense, let's say in cultural terms, establishing something like a cultural global standard, and maybe by this absorbing, so to say, or the niches. So this was this one narrative in connection with the internet. But at the same time, of course, there was also the opposite narrative, and the opposite narrative was that, particularly in a globalizing internet, there are basically enough niches for everyone in the world. In that sense, so to say, the internet could also cross-connect minorities and aggregate these together to something like a network where they can interchange. Yes. And so this is like, we could think about this like a continuum on a scale. So the one pole would be a standardization and absorption of everything but deviates, and on the other hand, of course, a plurality, a pluralism continuously evolving. Yes. Now, if we use this a little bit as a reference, as a framework for analysis, so what do you think is in that sense happening more in connection to the to the topic of our talk, the language and the so-called cultural diversity, the impact of media on immigrant communities. So how would you picture these two let's say, opposite trends? At least we could put them up front as hypotheses. What sort of is happening? What is happening more? Or how is it happening? And how may it evolve further? Sarah, would you like to, in that sense, begin to reflect on this metaphor, if you want to put it as a metaphor?
So, in relation to what's happening more, in a way that it's more diverse, but it's developing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think, well, first of all, it's quite interesting to see I don't want to say differences in definition, but different perspectives in relation to the new media. And I know conceptually in the literature it is considered the new media, but for immigrant communities, I don't think they're that new anymore. I think these are the current media that they use. And the fact that for the past 25 years or so, the internet has been developing so fast and in such a broad way. And indeed, all the niches in every part of the world can be accommodated with the needs in terms of linguistic diversity, cultural values, and so on, shows that it's not only the spread and the accessibility, but also different forms. And I think Florian's reflection on printed media versus what's happening now, where we do write, but it's typing, and it's also visual forms and recording of all sort of messages that they don't even require any input from a person. It's sometimes just the image, it's just the music, and that is all on the one hand a sign of better accessibility, but on the other hand, it's also getting out of control, or maybe there is nobody to control it, and it's really the input that individual puts in, and anyone can do that, anyone can contribute. So there are always the sides of the coin in terms of preservation of language, and not only language. There's always this sort of good way that communities could cultivate, but it's also a danger, because not only in terms of what's inputted in there, but also how it's being transformed, how it's being broadcasted to others. With printed words, it was much more, I don't want to say controlled, but it was much more organized, whereas now it's on the one hand it's widely accessible, but on the other hand anyone can input anything. So I guess these are the main reflections so far. But that also, I would say, allows for, kind of reflects the dynamics when we look at the scale of migration across the world. That also allows individuals to find themselves, no matter where they are in the world, how far away from home. They can always access this sort of safe space that would support them in terms of their cultural and linguistic values, because this is one of the most important value for immigrants to where they go abroad to seek for what they're familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Florian, how do you position yourself in this frame of reference, in the sense of the internet as a standardizer, the internet as a pluralizer of cultural identities, diversities, etc.?
There we, first of all, we should distinguish different groups. There are migrants, for example, to be concrete. These days, until yesterday, until the day before yesterday, there was the Francophonie summit in France. From participants of 30 countries came together. And what they share in common, above all, is the French language. And we know that one of the effects of French colonialism and Francophonie is that there is much more migration from formerly or even now Francophone countries in Africa to France than from other countries. So there is a presupposition. And when I say we have to distinguish different groups, also different languages. Are we talking about a language like French? Are we talking about languages with a written standard? Or are we talking about unwritten languages, which is to say, by far the greatest majority of all languages of the world? Only a very small fraction of all languages have a written standard. Now, there are language activists who argue that the internet and computer-mediated communication could help to the unwritten languages to survive. It is certainly true that using mobile phones, migrant speakers of such languages can stay in touch with their parents, friends, and so forth where they came from. But do these media have any effect on these languages? As I said, there are certain activists who say, well, yes, we can use the internet to provide these languages with a written form. Possible. Is anyone going to use it? That's a different question. It is an interesting question because it directs our attention once again to the fact that although we would like this to be, it is not the case that all languages are equal. Wherever we go, there is a hierarchy of languages. The national language ideology has not disappeared, with many, many consequences for daily life, for politics, for society, for administration, for education, you name it. And internationally, some languages, as we all know, since we are speaking English right now here, are much more important and economically more valuable than others. So when we are talking about preserving languages and cultures, we have to be more specific and say, is it possible to preserve, I don't know, Xhosa language in South Africa that has no written standard by means of computer-mediated communication? I don't know. And that depends on the particular case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, both of you have now raised several very interesting topics. I've taken down two terms. Like Sarah, you referred to language preservation. I think you also, Florian, and then Florian, you also used this term of hierarchy of languages. So, and here I'm also interested in your opinion and assessment. What happens currently more, or do both phenomena happen equally? So, I mean, the one scenario, of course, is in the sense of there may be a further concentration, let's say, on a few languages. And in that sense, of course, so English is the dominant language. But of course, I would also like to then talk about the English language as such with the specific questions. And or is it also the beginning of an age of bilinguality, multilinguality, etc.? So the underlying notion here, of course, is that language is a core element of identity. Is in that sense bilinguality or multilinguality, in your opinion, something good, something which should be enhanced? And what would be necessary for this? Or is it that politics should say, well, whatever language, so to say, prevail is going to prevail? So in that sense, again, in this, in this conflict of poles, either focusing on a few dominant languages, or so to say, an emphasis on bi and multilinguality. How here again, in that frame, would be your positions, and what may be then, so to say, the effects of this on our society? Maybe Sarah, and let's so to say play it like this, a little bit ping pong.
So I think before I answer your question, I would take a step back. And language is not only mode of communication. And this is something that I believe nowadays is being lost a lot in the media, because language is identity, it's a culture, it's a representation of culture. And there's a certain, in different languages, there's certain values and cultural values associated to certain words that cannot be so easily translated. It's also the general tradition of language and certain words, certain forms of communication that are being celebrated in certain communities. But it's also, especially for immigrants, it's a channel through which they access their social networks. So it's not only individuals' identity, but it's a group's identity that represents something distinct in certain host society. And this also comes with the fact that by language, no matter what language, certain groups have certain mutual understanding, which cannot always be transferred beyond that community. And I think this is very important, especially when we look at, for instance, children and that notion of bilinguality or multilinguality. You both began with your personal reflection in terms of your identity. So perhaps now it's my turn. My daughter, in turn, she's trilingual. She's only 6, and she can speak Polish, Turkish, and English. And she has been raised in a way that every person in her life represents different language. But it's not only in terms of practical, pragmatic aspect that when she goes abroad, she can talk in different languages, but it's also the fact that, for instance, with Turkish, her grandparents are from Northern Cyprus, and they don't really speak English, and I cannot expect them to learn at their retirement age to learn English or Polish. But this language is the form of channel and connection with them, and this is also how they transfer where they come from, because they also come from mixed background. And that also transfer on the values and some sort of capital for her as well, in this case, language. But if not the language, she would not have access to half of her family. And I think this is something that, apart from being comfortable by speaking English, because I think nowadays, especially in Europe, you can go anywhere in Europe and be able to speak English, perhaps apart from Germany, because they're quite adamant about speaking German, and France in this case probably as well. But it's the matter of especially educating the new generations that this is the sort of package that they come with to the world. And there's the world is open up, but that the ability to speak languages, to connect with where they come from, where they're going to, this is the very powerful tool that they have. And this is something that, especially in terms of immigrant communities, it allows them to be a bridge between both communities. And I think this is extreme value in terms of what they can bring into the communities. And we do see already situations where those languages merge. we have, well, Esperanto is one thing, but this, from Polish perspective, it was for a long time very common for Polish migrants to borrow English words and sort of make them into Ponglish, they were called. And this is when, this is where the differences between language become blurred, but that's when the meaning is lost, because you can translate the word itself, but you cannot translate the meaning behind it and the value behind it. And I think that bilinguality or multilinguality, by all means, should be enhanced, but to enrich the capital rather than just blurring it all into, more dominant languages that we know they can be assessed by, whatever is legally established, let's say in European Union or any other countries, but that's not the point.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it was very interesting to hear about your daughter. So there were some references to our son, who is now 15, and of course, I mean, we're living in Austria, so he will speak German. But whenever he speaks on the internet with his cousins in France, he always uses French. But when they would write, they would use English, because he can speak French, he comprehends French, but he cannot write French because he doesn't have it, so to say, at school. So in that sense, even in that sense, with the spoken language or the written language, you can have these flip-flops. Florian, your position on bilinguality, multilinguality, etc., etc.
When I would have asked my grandmother, what's your identity? She would have said, what are you talking about, boy? Identity, schmentity. I'm Greek, basta.
Mm-hmm.
We should be aware of the fact that, and I'm saying this because, excuse me for mentioning it, I've written 3 books about identity. And what I know is it's a big fashion, and that's about it. And let me ask you, Sarah, spaghetti, is that an English word?
Well, it depends how you take it, but I know where exactly you're heading to.
You know what I'm heading to. There's an interesting tendency for speakers of, let's say, dominated languages, or languages that are perceived to be threatened. By the way, there's a UNESCO convention for the preservation of endangered languages, and a whole atlas for that. There's an unfortunate tendency among speakers of such small languages to fend off loanwords. Now, one of the great strengths of English is that there is absolutely no barrier. You can say anything in English. You can adopt any word from any language, as long as others also accept it. And accordingly, while this is not uncommon in very many other languages, take French, take Italian these days, the linguistic purism that is trying to fend off the influence of other languages is a one-to-one correspondent equivalent to racism, which is very unfortunate and is based eventually on the ideology of linguistic nationalism, which has taught us that language is something that needs to be preserved, that comprises our spirit, our culture, our heritage, and so forth. The things that you have mentioned, Sarah, that are most important within your family context, they are instrumental. That your daughter can speak with your parents or her grandparents. That's not symbolic. That's a functional, instrumental aspect of this kind of bilinguality or trilingual, as you said. As far as these instrumental functions go, obviously, yes, bilingualism or multilingualism is to be welcomed and to be cultivated, which also is not at all a matter of course. Because if we go a little more than a generation back, it was standard knowledge. Everybody knew that bringing up children with more than one language is detrimental to their cognitive development. That we should keep in mind, that whether or not bilingualism is good or bad has a historical dimension. People do not agree about this across times and across communities. Nowadays, in Western language, in Western countries, in the wake of decolonization in particular, it has become fashionable to say, yes, we have to respect other languages. They encompass important cultural heritage and so forth. This is to alleviate bad conscience. But whether it is a valuable and sustainable policy is another question. And in order to answer this question, we have to return to the point I made earlier, namely that all languages exist in a hierarchy. And can we challenge this hierarchy and say, yes, Frisian is just as valuable as Dutch in the Netherlands? The answer clearly is no.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know what conclusions you want to draw from this.
We're thinking, debating. Florian, when you refer to spaghetti, I must say I do not know now the linguistic source of the word spaghetti, but what I was told is Italians don't eat spaghetti with spoons. It's obviously non-Italians. I would like to now invest one question into the English language. Yes. I mean, I think that there are many things one could say about the English language. Maybe two comments. I mean, the one is, in a certain sense, if we look at the evolution of the English language, you could qualify it perhaps as something like an Esperanto language, you know, blending together different Germanic and Romance or Latin languages. Yes, I mean, if you look at how the Normans went in and the Anglo-Saxons and everything. And there's always sometimes, if I'm humoristic and I want to tease an English teacher, I would ask the English teacher, well, could you explain why does the English language not have articles? Because basically most of the Indo-European languages are having articles. Yes. I mean, David Crystal also, I don't know if you know his very interesting book. He wrote this book, English as a Global Language, but of course it also had other connotations. How do you see the role and more so the future role of English in the world? Does the global role of function of English in the world, so to say, change or not change? In which ways? So what is happening with the English language, in terms to our topic about language and cultural diversity? Yes, about this, of course, by itself could be the topic of a whole lecture. Yes, but in that sense, we don't have the time now here. Because sometimes we take obviously English granted as it is, so to say. But if you reflect about the English language, yes, what are the next steps or in its, so to say, role impacts English may have or not have, so to say, on our culture and cultural diversity?
I guess,
Maybe
Florian,
Sarah.
this
Maybe
was a
Sarah.
question for you.
Huh?
I think I believe this question should be addressed to Florian.
Okay. Okay, Florian.
David, it was you. You mentioned Esperanto.
Could be. I'm not sure about that.
You mentioned Esperanto.
I think Sarah. I think Sarah had it first, but I don't know. I mean, I cannot recall it.
Well, then let me just remind you of one thing that. Zamenhof is closer to Zara than to us, maybe. But let me remind you of something he said about the need for an international language. What did he say? He said, the real causes of conflict among human beings are religion and language. And we see nowadays lots of proof for how true this is. Until a couple of years ago, Kyiv was largely a Russian-speaking city. Now, Russian is almost criminalized in Ukraine. And people are proud to speak Ukrainian. There are countless other examples which tell us that a very important function of language is to be able to hate others, which is very sad. Now, returning to your question concerning the future global role of English, will it be possible to keep this away from the still growing English speech community across the globe? That is a very important and interesting question. There are many different things to be considered. One is that if it wasn't for the fact that the rise of the United States followed on the trace of the decline of the British Empire, it wouldn't be where it is today. English, yes, has become a very practical means of communication across language boundaries, but it is also, and still is, the language of the world's hegemon. One cannot forget this. And when I see that in several Eastern African countries, Chinese as a foreign language is on the rise, I find this very interesting to observe. In a sense, language's position in the world, and we can see this very clearly when we look at Russian, depends on the major country or countries' power relations in the world. And this is reflected in foreign language education all over the world. And the question then is, will the majority of all countries in the world continue to teach English as the first foreign language at school. That will be an important part. If we can answer this, we can make more reliable predictions about the future of global English.
Well, I think you pinpointed many interesting aspects, Florian. The one we talk a lot about, the, let's say, economic cooperation, but also competition between China and the United States. But we could, of course, ask ourselves, may this also lead to cultural, how should I say, so competition, yes. And will we learn Chinese, or will the Chinese learn faster English? So I think this has, of course, it dives into many different aspects. Now, looking at the, so to say, at the time, since we're now about at 45, so probably, I mean, I think many more questions would come to my mind, but of course I have to make a hierarchy in that sense. So one question in that sense I would like to ask now is focusing on technology, because we had a panel discussion like this a few weeks earlier, where we talked a lot about artificial intelligence. We could imagine, I mean, somehow it is being practiced anyway, but we could imagine further something like, let's say, automated, imagine this, not meaning it will come into effect. We could imagine automated translation programs. Of course, nowadays there are many devices to translate language in written form, but let us say we could have devices, let us say, I speak English, Sarah speaks Polish, and you, Florian, you speak Japanese, yes, and let's make like even German. I could speak in German, and this being then automatically translated through headsets, let's say into Polish and into Japanese, and then this could go back and forth like this. Yes. So, if you want to speculate further about possible impacts of technology, yes? So, and then we could have this layer. So, do you expect we will see more and more technical devices like this? Then, of course, how good or how bad will they be in the functionality? I think you also indicated, Sarah, so to which extent can one translate a language? But even if these devices are in that sense not perfect, but so to say somehow basic, will they be applied, and will they then have, so to say, an impact on society? So, meaning in that sense, why do we still the needs of some English as one manifestation of a global language? Will this lead to more bridging between different cultures? Does it mean I could go over to Japan, I could talk with somebody or have a basic conversation with somebody in Japan who does not know English in that sense? Yes. Even within the European Union, if you think about this, may there be more political connectedness? Yes. So the potential impact of technological devices engaging in simultaneous translations in a very responsive way, allowing to stimulate or emulate instant conversations in different languages at the same time. So will these technologies come? What should be taken into account? Where do we have to be careful? And what may be the implications of these? This is a question, of course, I would like to ask both of you.
So perhaps maybe this time I can start from a more pragmatic perspective, since actually, as you were asking this question, I've had a lot of examples running through my mind.
Good,
and I think it's always about balance, I guess, because technology, and we cannot escape that, whether it's AI or just simple softwares or any other devices, we can't escape it. And I guess there's no point of fighting with it, because they will overcome, that will overcome anyway. But I guess it's a matter of using it in a most pragmatic way, in a way that technology can make it, or can enable us, or can enable immigrant communities to be simply more accessible. And the simplest example in Poland, that was 2 years ago when the war started in Ukraine, but in Germany in 2014-15, when there was a refugee crisis, and I can give plenty of other examples. So imagine all of a sudden you have a big influx of people who speak different language and they need assistance. Luckily, Poland had some experience with Ukrainian workers, and languages are relatively similar, so it was manageable. But all the stress and trauma that was associated with that war fleeing movement, it had impact on communication ability. So having technology or solutions to allow people to access whatever support services they had offered. Back then, at the very beginning, it was in Polish. Gradually, it increased to Ukrainian, and the offer for languages was much greater. That could certainly help to support those people. If we have, so I will give examples, quite a sort of Poland-centric, but it's also quite interesting case, because Poland is the country that for a long time it was country of emigration. So it was Polish people who had to tackle different languages in Europe. Now it's quite contrary. Over the past couple of years, we have such a variety of different migrant groups that country does not have capacity to learn Filipino language, all sort of languages from Latin America. We have great Vietnamese community, or community from India. And that one happens much faster than system can catch up on that. So technology in here is much appreciated, because it allows to help. I was in a hospital the other day, and the lady from Ukraine needed help, and there was absolutely nobody who could help her with that, other than Google Translate or DeepL. I'm not sure if I can use the names here, but this was the only really tool to allow to help her, because nobody had such language skills, which is, not appropriate, but she needed help ad hoc. But I think we have to be careful, because on the other hand, having a tool that could instantly translate a language, it can simply make us a bit lousy in terms of our capacity, in terms of the language we use, because of course it's much more comfortable to learn English, use English, and communicate just English, but that's not the point. So I think yes, use technology with wherever it's needed, whenever it should be, but at the same time, don't forget about the variety, because that's also important. And when it comes to kind of, for instance, with a more pragmatic aspect, relationships, or, contact, social networking, or work, I'm not sure if that can be substituted with the technology and the software that would only, translate the words, but not the meaning behind it.
Yes, I mean, when you talked about some sectors of labor, I mean, one example sometimes being mentioned is, if you look at supportive staff in hospitals or the medical sector, is where, so to say, the social workers or the medical workers don't speak the native language, but the patients or the native language. So there's of course a need in that sense to have here some bridges. Florian, how do you see technology in that context? What may happen? What should happen? What should we take into account into this approach?
Yeah. Okay. Well, since we don't have all that much time left, 3 points. The first one is, certainly the technology is practical, especially for migrants. Immigrants, even if they're very poor, they all have a smartphone, and they know why. To them, it is very, very helpful in medical services, administrative, immigration, education, you name it. There's no doubt about that. The second point is technology does not make the hierarchy of languages disappear. The development of all of these technologies depends on data, on large data sets, and the bigger your language corpus, the better they get. Which is simply to say that in automatic translation and in other services, the most used languages, in particular English, produce the best results. So translation between, say, English and French is incredibly good. And there's no translator who doesn't use these programs. But translation between Sami and English is terribly poor because there's no basis. And this will be continuing for the foreseeable future. Third point is, and that is something that Sarah mentioned earlier in our discussion, control, which tends to be forgotten. Immigrants don't care very much unless they are working for a criminal network, but control is vital. Control means that all the companies, and they are companies, they are not non-government organizations or state institutions. These are companies, the social media. They constantly extract personal information, using this information outside the context in which it was offered for their own purposes. And it is getting more difficult by the day to exercise control over this. Now, if I'm looking at the screen, I'm seeing that you are being funded, among others, by the European Union, which plays an important role to try to exercise more control. And if I understand it correctly, there is an ongoing, continuous struggle between the European Union and the United States to regulate communication technologies in the internet. And that is a big topic we cannot continue discussing today, but I think when we're talking about computer-mediated communication and immigration, that should not be forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When you use this phrase of hierarchy of languages, Florian, and one wants to create an analogy with networks, so often also talk about networks, also in the domain of networks, probably one sees hierarchy of networks. So, well, I would like to, in the sense of a closing of our discussion, one last question. I don't know, of course, this also could lead to long reply, but maybe both of you could try to, so to say, summarize it, pinpoint it, so to say, in about 2 or 3 minutes each. And this, I would, as the final question, I would like to refer to politics. Yes. So, in your opinion, responsible politics or policy in a responsible democracy, yes, how should, a very, very big question, but of course, please just slice it down, is how should responsible politics address language and cultural diversity, also in connection, of course, to the topic then of media and immigrant communities, yes? I mean, we know all these political narratives nowadays, also how migration is being framed is, I mean, being nastily targeted by populism, right-wing populism is. So in that sense, responsible politics. I mean, if it were you, so to say, to put together 5 bullet points, what should be done? This would be, in that sense, our final plaidoyer, yes, our final round. Whoever would want to begin first with something like 5 issues to be addressed by politics in your home country or on the European level or globally, however you would like to address this.
Florian, you can...
Yes.
I was just going to give the floor back to Florian so I can get my head around. Because, to be honest, once you said responsible politics, my question was, what? So okay. I'm not quite, well, I guess this is a completely different topic.
Non-populist politics is.
Yes, I know that. Yes. Okay, so, well, I certainly think that it should be with respect. And I will talk predominantly from Polish context, but of course, I don't think this should be treated uniquely, and it can be applicable across different countries and European level. So first of all, the negative image that is dominated in the media, especially, TV and so on, should be limited, because this is pretty much in Poland when the topic of immigrants comes up, when there is something bad happening. It should account for diversity, and considering that in Europe, and not only, but in countries, there is such a diverse group of immigrant groups, this should be accounted for. When it comes to, so one of the good examples, I would say, in Poland are programs, and there are radio stations that have different programs in different languages. So I think this is a good opportunity. I know it's not quite politics, but I think this is a good way to show the visibility, but also to give voice. And I think this is what the politics also should account for, is the voice of those who are frequently, perhaps not excluded, but not noticeable. Sorry.
Well, okay.
As short as it was, perhaps it wasn't comprehensive, but I'm aware of the time.
A very nice plaidoyer. Florian.
The basic conflict is between state and market. It is about control of the internet, and whether this should be in terms of politics entrusted to the market or to state authority. This conflict is unresolved, and it needs to be resolved. We should remember that copyright came into existence only with the print culture, with print capitalism. And now we need internet rights. They are not sufficient as they are nowadays. There are no universal definitions of what needs to be cleaned out. Hate speech, criminal incentives, and these kinds of things. Who should do the control? In the United States, there's a tendency to leave this to the market. In the European Union, there's a tendency to say, well, we need indeed government control more than we have right now. This is unresolved and needs to be resolved with universal definitions of what is hate speech, what is incentive to violence, and so forth. And one particular measure that I would suggest concerning linguistic diversity is this. We know that the social media already employ moderators who work all day to clean out unacceptable posts and so forth. But they do this for a very small number of languages only. Now, if we pass legislation that compels internet providers to clear out whatever runs over their platform in terms of hate speech, criminal activities, and so forth, not only in Polish, in German, in French, but in all languages of the world, then that would be a very, very heavy burden on the suppliers of social media.
Okay. Well, thank you. Very, very interesting to listen. I think this was a very challenging, mind-setting, thought-provoking, thought-furthering discussion which we had. Again, many thanks to both of our speakers, to Sarah, Dr. Dıversıty from the University of Warsaw, to Florian, Professor Kulmas from the University of Duisburg-Essen. Many thanks also to our audience who had listened throughout the whole time. This here was a live stream, but a copy of this also will be posted to the internet. So there's obviously possibility and opportunity to zoom into the conversation we had and its different aspects. In that sense, again, thank you, Sarah. Again, thank you, Florian, for having been with us. And I wish you all a nice day. We're only in the middle of our working day, Monday, if this would be Central European time. So there's still a way to go for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.